It all started on Christmas Eve when Grace Whitmore watched her husband kiss another woman on a live stream while she sat alone, 7 months pregnant. He thought she would cry, beg, and wait for him to come home. But that night, she made a phone call that would destroy his empire. When Marcus returned from his luxury resort getaway, the house was sold, his accounts were frozen, and divorce papers were waiting. What came next was a battle so brutal, the FBI got involved. This is the story of a woman who lost everything in one night and spent the next 3 years turning her heartbreak into power. Before we begin, hit that like button, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. You will not believe how this ends. Let us start. The Instagram live stream lit up Grace Whitmore's phone screen at exactly 9:15 on Christmas Eve. She sat alone in the dim living room, one hand resting on her 7-month pregnant belly, the other gripping the device that was about to shatter her entire world. The camera focused on a marble stage at the Aspen Grand Resort. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Women in designer gowns swirled champagne. Men in tuxedos laughed at jokes she could not hear. And there, center stage beneath a banner reading, New Beginnings Charity Gala, stood her husband. Marcus Whitmore looked perfect. His black tuxedo fit like it was sewn onto his athletic frame. His dark hair was styled exactly the way she used to fix it before events. His smile was wet and confident, the same smile that had convinced her 5 years ago to give up everything and marry him. But it was not his smile that made Grace's water glass slip from her fingers and shatter against the hardwood floor. It was the woman beside him. Bianca Rhodes wore a gold dress that shimmered under the lights like liquid metal. Her blonde hair cascaded over bare shoulders. Her red lips curved into a triumphant smile as Marcus wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close. The host's voice boomed through the phone's tiny speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, to the man who has everything, success, charm, and the heart of a beautiful woman. The crowd erupted in applause. Marcus turned to Bianca. She tilted her face up toward his, and then he kissed her. Not a polite kiss on the cheek, not an accidental brush of lips, a full, deliberate, possessive kiss that lasted 3 seconds, too long to be anything but intentional. The crowd cheered louder. Champagne glasses clinked. Camera flashes exploded like tiny stars. Grace sat frozen. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears, drowning out everything else. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, where their son kicked once, as if sensing her distress. She whispered to the child inside her, "He just made the biggest mistake of his life." The live stream continued. Marcus and Bianca laughed together, their heads closed, their hands intertwined. The host made a joke about power couples and new chapters. Someone in the background shouted, "Kiss her again." Grace's phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. The notification banner appeared over the live stream. Emergency board meeting running late. Don't wait up. Merry Christmas. She stared at the message, then at the screen, where Marcus was now toasting with investors while Bianca stood at his side like she belonged there. The Christmas tree lights blinked rhythmically behind Grace. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to glowing embers. The house that she had designed herself, the house that was supposed to be their forever home, felt suddenly like a beautiful prison. Grace stood slowly, her movements careful despite the rage building in her chest. She walked to the mantel and picked up their wedding photo. 5 years ago, she had been radiant in white lace. Marcus had looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. Now he looked at Bianca Rhodes the same way. She set the photo face down on the mantel. Then she opened her laptop. The shared bank account loaded after she entered the password. She scrolled through recent transactions, looking for anything unusual. And there it was, posted just 2 days ago. Aspen Grand Resort. Presidential suite. 2 guests, 4 nights, $87,000. Grace clicked on the transaction details. The confirmation email auto-forwarded to their shared account. Reservation holder Marcus Whitmore. Secondary guest Bianca Rhodes. Her hands shook as she kept clicking. Another folder, locked, titled BR_personal. She tried the password. Bianca 2024. It opened. Inside were photos from Paris. Marcus and Bianca at the Eiffel Tower. Marcus and Bianca drinking wine at a sidewalk cafe. Marcus and Bianca kissing in front of Notre Dame Cathedral. Last month, he had told her he was attending an investor conference in France. She had stayed home because Flying at 6 months pregnant was risky. He had called her every night, told her he missed her, sent her photos of empty conference rooms and boring PowerPoint slides. All lies. Grace kept scrolling. She found contract drafts, documents transferring company shares into something called Rhodes Family Trust, legal paperwork outlining asset protection strategies, and then she found the text message screenshots. Marcus to Bianca, dated 3 weeks ago. Once the baby is born, I will file. The prenup expires at 5 years. We are at 4 years, 11 months. She gets nothing. Bianca's response, what about the house? Marcus, in her name only. Gift from her dead father. She can keep it. We will have everything else. Grace read the messages 3 times. Each word burned into her memory like a brand. She thought about this nursery upstairs. The crib still in its box because Marcus kept saying he was too busy to assemble it. The tiny clothes she had washed and folded by herself. The books she had bought to read to their son. She thought about how she had left her architecture firm to support Marcus's tech startup. How she had designed this house while he built his company. How she had believed they were partners building an empire together. She thought about her mother, dead 2 years now, who had warned her that Marcus was too charming to be trusted. She thought about her sister, who had stopped calling after Grace chose Marcus over family. She thought about every lonely night, every broken promise, every time he had made her feel like she was overreacting or being paranoid or not supportive enough. The baby kicked again, harder this time. Grace placed both hands on her belly and whispered, I am sorry, sweetheart, but your father does not get to win. She picked up her phone and searched Emergency Divorce Attorney, Los Angeles. The first result was a 24-hour hotline. Battered Women's Legal Aid, she dialed. A woman's voice answered after 2 rings. Battered Women's Legal Aid, this is Claire speaking. Are you safe? Grace's voice came out steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I am not battered, but I am about to go to war. There was a pause. Then the woman said slowly, Grace Whitmore. Oh my God, it is me, Claire Bennett, from Riverside High School. Grace's breath caught. Claire Bennett. They had been inseparable in high school, best friends who swore they would be in each other's weddings. But after Grace married Marcus, he had slowly, carefully, cut her off from everyone who knew her before him. Claire, Grace whispered. Grace, what happened? I have not heard from you in 10 years. Are you hurt? Where are you? I am home, 7 months pregnant. And I just found out my husband is planning to divorce me the day after our prenup expires, so I get nothing. Silence. Then Claire's voice turned cold and sharp. Send me everything, every document, every photo, every message. I am a partner at Morrison and Associates now. I will be at your house in 1 hour. Claire, it is Christmas Eve. You do not have to. I'm already grabbing my laptop. Text me your address. We have work to do. Grace sent the address. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the snow beginning to fall. Across the street, families gathered around lit trees. Children laughed. Couples kissed under mistletoe. She whispered to her reflection in the glass. Merry Christmas, Marcus. I hope you enjoyed tonight. It is the last happy moment you will ever have. Claire Bennett arrived at 11:30 on Christmas Eve with 2 laptops, a briefcase, and a determination that reminded Grace why they had been best friends. Claire was tall and sharp-featured, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore jeans and a Georgetown law sweatshirt, and she moved through Grace's house like a general surveying a battlefield. Show me everything, Claire said, setting up at the dining room table. Grace handed over her laptop. The evidence was still open on the screen. Photos, bank statements, contract drafts, text messages. Claire read in silence for 20 minutes. Her expression darkened with each page. Finally, she looked up. Grace, this is not just a divorce case. This is fraud, embezzlement, asset concealment. Marcus is not just cheating on you. He is stealing from his own company to fund his affair. Grace sat down heavily. What does that mean? It means we do not just file for divorce. We file criminal complaints. We freeze every asset. We contact the prosecutor. And we make sure that when Marcus Whitmore wakes up tomorrow morning, his entire world is on fire. Can we do that on Christmas? Claire smiled coldly. Emergency court filings do not take holidays. Neither does justice. She opened her phone and made 3 calls. First to a forensic accountant who owed her a favor. Second to a real estate broker named Robert Hayes. Third to Judge Patricia Morrison, who was on holiday duty at the courthouse. By midnight, they had a plan. Step 1, freeze all joint accounts. Emergency court order to be filed within the hour. Step 2, sell the house of Bowers. It was titled solely in Grace's name, a wedding gift from her late father. Marcus had no legal claim to it. Step 3, file for divorce and submit fraud evidence to the district attorney's office simultaneously. The media impact of a Christmas Day filing would be devastating. Step 4, destroy Marcus Whitmore so completely that he would never recover. There is one problem, Grace said quietly. The prenup expires in 2 weeks. If we file now, he can claim we are jumping the gun and that the prenup should still apply. Claire shook her head. The prenup becomes void if either party commits fraud or adultery. We have evidence of both. The prenup is dead. Grace felt something shift inside her. For months, she had felt powerless, trapped, invisible. Now she felt dangerous. At 12:30 in the morning on Christmas Day, Claire drove Grace to the courthouse. The building was mostly dark except for the emergency filing office. Judge Patricia Morrison was a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She reviewed their documents with the precision of a surgeon examining x-rays. Mrs. Whitmore, the judge said slowly, these are very serious allegations. You are accusing your husband of embezzlement, fraud, and asset concealment. You understand that if these claims are false, you could face legal consequences. I understand, Your Honor, but they are not false. Judge Morrison flipped through the bank statements, the photos, the text messages where Marcus explicitly outlined his plan to leave Grace with nothing. The judge removed her glasses. Emergency order granted. All joint accounts are frozen effective immediately. Mr. Whitmore will be notified by the court within 24 hours. This hearing is adjourned. Grace and Claire walked out of the courthouse into the snowy Christmas morning. How long before he finds out? Grace asked. His credit cards will start declining around breakfast time. He will call the bank. They will tell him the accounts are frozen by court order. Then he will call you. And what do I say? Claire smiled. Nothing. Let him wonder. They drove back to Grace's house. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the snow pink and gold. Robert Hayes arrived at 7 in the morning. He was a tall man in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes. He had known Grace's father for 30 years. Your dad saved my business in 2008, Robert said, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers. Time to return the favor. He explained the plan. The house was appraised at $2.3 million. Robert had a buyer willing to pay $4.8 million in cash. The sale could close in 48 hours. Who would pay double? Grace asked. Robert's smile was grim. A venture capitalist who hates your husband. Marcus destroyed his daughter's startup 3 years ago, crushed her company, and laughed about it in a board meeting. The man has been waiting for a chance to hurt Marcus ever since. When I told him you were selling, he jumped at the opportunity. Grace thought about that. Revenge by proxy. She should have felt guilty. Instead, she felt satisfied. Do it, she said. The movers arrived at 8. Grace had already packed everything that mattered. Her clothes, the baby items, her architecture portfolio, photos of her parents. She left the wedding album on the mantle, left Marcus's clothes in the closet, left the furniture they had chosen together. By 2 in the afternoon, the house was empty. Grace stood in the living room where she had watched Marcus kiss Bianca on the live stream just 17 hours earlier. The room echoed, sunlight streamed through bare windows. She placed her wedding ring on the kitchen counter with a note written in clean block letters. You wanted new beginnings. Here is mine. Then she walked out and did not look back. Claire drove her to a small, furnished apartment across town. It was nothing like the house Grace had designed, but it was hers, paid for with money from her father's trust that Marcus had never been able to touch. How do you feel? Claire asked. Grace thought about the question. She was 7 months pregnant, divorcing her husband. Her life was imploding. But she felt something she had not felt in years. Powerful, Grace said. Her phone rang. Marcus. She declined the call. He called again. Declined. A text appeared. What the hell did you do? Call me now. Grace turned off her phone. Claire handed her a glass of water. The prosecutor wants to meet with you tomorrow. We have enough evidence to open a criminal investigation into Marcus's company finances. If they find what I think they will find, he is looking at federal charges. How long would he go to prison? 10 to 20 years if convicted. Grace sipped the water and felt the baby kick. She whispered to her belly, "Your father made a choice. Now he gets to live with it." That night, she slept better than she had in months. Across town, in a luxury suite in Aspen, Marcus Whitmore was screaming at his phone as every credit card declined and his bank informed him that his accounts were frozen by court order. His perfect Christmas was over, and Grace's war had just begun. Grace woke on December 26 to 17 missed calls from Marcus and a message from Claire that simply read, "He knows, brace yourself." At 9 in the morning, a sheriff's deputy knocked on her apartment door. Grace, still in pajamas with her pregnant belly stretching the fabric, signed for the legal documents with shaking hands. Marcus's countersuit was 80 pages long. The allegations were designed to destroy her. He claimed Grace had stolen $4.8 million in community property by selling the house without his consent. He accused her of mental instability and cited her erratic behavior over the past weeks. He filed for emergency custody of their unborn child, claiming Grace was a danger to herself and the baby. The final page contained a restraining order. Grace was required to undergo psychiatric evaluation within 72 hours. She was forbidden from making any financial decisions without court approval. And most devastating of all, any custody arrangement after the baby's birth would require supervised visitation pending the outcome of the evaluation. Claire arrived within the hour, fury radiating from her like heat. "He is playing dirty," Claire said, pacing Grace's small living room. "He knows we have him on fraud, so he is trying to make you look unstable to discredit your testimony." "Can he do that?" Grace asked quietly. "He can try, but we have something he does not have." "What?" "The truth, and a prosecutor who hates corrupt CEOs." They met with the prosecutor at 2 that afternoon. His name was Richard Sullivan, a thin man in his 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for taking down white-collar criminals. He listened to their evidence for 2 hours. Bank records showing Marcus transferring company funds into private accounts. Emails between Marcus and Bianca, discussing asset concealment strategies. Photos and receipts from their affair. "This is good," Richard Sullivan said finally. "But I need more. I need witnesses. Employees who saw the fraud happening. People willing to testify." Claire leaned forward. "What if I told you I am already representing 3 employees in a wage theft lawsuit against Marcus's company?" The prosecutor's eyes sharpened. "How many employees total were affected?" "At least 40. Marcus has been skimming payroll for 2 years, using the money to fund personal expenses." Richard Sullivan smiled for the first time. "Get me those employees. Get me signed statements. If we can prove a pattern of fraud, I can get a grand jury indictment within a month." Grace felt hope stirring, but it died when her phone buzzed with an alert. A new message from an unknown number. A photo of Grace leaving the courthouse on Christmas morning. The text read, "Smile for the cameras. Grace, you just committed fraud." Then a second message, "Check your email." Grace opened her email with trembling hands. A legal document from Whitmore Industries' legal department waited in her inbox. Marcus had filed a civil lawsuit accusing Grace of theft, defamation, and corporate espionage. He claimed she had stolen confidential company information and used it to damage his reputation. He was suing for $10 million in damages. Claire read over her shoulder and swore softly. "He is burying you in lawsuits, trying to drain your resources and break your will before the criminal case even starts." "Will it work?" Grace whispered. "Not if we fight smarter." Claire made another phone call, this time to a reporter she knew at the Los Angeles Times. The story broke that evening. Tech CEO accused of fraud by pregnant wife. The article included carefully selected details from Grace's evidence: the Aspen resort photos, the bank transfers, the text messages about the prenup. Marcus's company went into crisis mode. His board of directors called an emergency meeting. Investors started asking questions, and Marcus called Grace for the 20th time. This time, she answered. "You are going to regret this," Marcus said, his voice cold and controlled. "I already regret marrying you," Grace replied. Everything else is just details. You think you are smart. You think you can destroy me, Grace. I built an empire, Dupabin. You were just the pretty decoration who kept the house clean. And you were just the liar who wore a good suit. I guess we both made mistakes. I will take everything from you. The baby, the money, your reputation. By the time I am done, you will be broken and alone and wishing you had just stayed quiet like a good wife. Grace felt the baby kick hard, as if reacting to his father's voice. Marcus, she said softly, you already made me a good wife. Patient, forgiving, trusting. That woman is dead. You killed her on Christmas Eve when you kissed your mistress on a stage and forgot I existed. What you are dealing with now is someone you do not know, someone you created, and she is not going to stop until you lose everything. She hung up. Claire looked at her with something like awe. That was either very brave or very stupid. Maybe both, Grace said. Then she felt a sharp pain low in her belly. She gasped and grabbed the arm of the couch. Grace, Claire moved toward her. What is wrong? I do not know. It hurts. Another pain, sharper this time, radiating from her lower back. Claire pulled out her phone. I am calling an ambulance. No, just take me to the hospital. It is probably nothing. But as they rushed out of the apartment, Grace felt a wetness between her legs and knew with terrible certainty that something was very wrong. The baby was coming, 2 months early, and Grace was not ready. The emergency room at Mercy General Hospital was bright and cold. A doctor examined Grace quickly, her face serious. Your blood pressure is dangerously high, Dr. Robert Matthews said, checking the monitor. 180 over 110. You are showing signs of severe preeclampsia. We need to induce labor within the next few hours or you risk stroke or seizure. Grace lay on the hospital bed, trying to process the words. But I am only 32 weeks. The baby is too early. The baby will be premature, yes, but he has a much better chance in the NICU than he does if we wait and you have a stroke. We need to start induction now. Claire stood beside the bed, holding Grace's hand. Whatever you need, I am here. Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. Okay. Do it. The contractions started within an hour. Grace had imagined her labor happening differently. Marcus beside her. A peaceful delivery. Their son arriving healthy and full term. Instead, she labored alone except for Claire. Her body racked with pain while her husband celebrated Christmas in Aspen with his mistress. At 8 that evening, a nurse entered the room with an uncomfortable expression. Mrs. Whitmore, there is someone here to see you. He says he is your husband. Grace's head snapped up. Marcus is here. He is in the waiting room. He says he has a right to be present for the birth. Tell him to leave. Now. The nurse nodded and disappeared. 5 minutes later, Claire's phone rang. She stepped into the hallway and returned with her jaw clenched. Grace, we have a problem. Marcus filed an emergency motion with Judge Thomas Bradford. He is claiming that your preeclampsia proves you are unfit to care for a newborn. He is requesting temporary custody the moment the baby is born. Grace tried to sit up, but another contraction hit, stealing her breath. He cannot do that, she gasped. He was not even here. He does not care about this baby. I know, but Judge Bradford is known for father's rights rulings. And Marcus's lawyers are very good at making everything sound reasonable. What do? We fight. But Grace, there is something you need to know. Judge Bradford is holding an emergency video hearing in 1 hour. From your hospital room. What? Marcus demanded it. The judge agreed. He is going to rule on temporary custody tonight. Grace closed her eyes. Another contraction tore through her. This time, she screamed. The next hour was a nightmare. Grace labored through contractions while a laptop was set up at the foot of her bed. Judge Thomas Bradford appeared on the screen, his face stern and impatient. This is highly irregular, the judge said. But given the circumstances, I am willing to hear emergency motions. Mr. Whitmore, your attorney may proceed. Marcus's lawyer was a polished woman in her 50s named Victoria Cross. She spoke in smooth, reasonable tones that made everything sound sensible. Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore is clearly experiencing a medical crisis. She has demonstrated erratic behavior over the past week, including selling the family home without notice, filing frivolous lawsuits, and making wild accusations. Now she is giving birth prematurely due to stress she created herself. We believe the child's welfare requires immediate protective measures. Grace tried to speak, but another contraction made her cry out in pain. Judge Bradford frowned. Mrs. Whitmore, are you able to participate in this hearing? Yes, Grace managed between gasps. Your Honor, my husband was not even present for this pregnancy. He has been having an affair for months. He planned to abandon us. Everything I did was to protect myself and my child. That is her interpretation, Victoria Cross said smoothly. The reality is that Mrs. Whitmore has made impulsive, destructive decisions that put her unborn child at risk. She is not stable enough to be a primary caregiver. Bushel Clare argued forcefully, presenting evidence of Marcus's fraud and adultery, but Judge Bradford seemed unmoved. At 10:30 that night, between contractions, the judge made his ruling. I am granting temporary custody to Mr. Whitmore pending a full psychiatric evaluation of Mrs. Whitmore. The child will be placed in NICU care with Mr. Whitmore as the custodial parent. Mrs. Whitmore will be allowed supervised visitation only. Grace screamed, but this time not from pain. You cannot take my baby. The order takes effect once the child is born. Mrs. Whitmore, I suggest you focus on your health. This hearing is adjourned. The screen went dark. Grace sobbed uncontrollably while Claire held her hand and whispered, We will fix this. I promise, we will fix this. But the contractions were coming faster now. The baby was coming, whether Grace was ready or not. At 2:15 in the morning on December 27th, Dylan Robert Whitmore entered the world. He weighed 3 pounds and 2 ounces. His cry was weak but determined. The nurses wrapped him in blankets and placed him on Grace's chest for exactly 10 minutes while they checked his vital signs. Grace held her son and memorized every detail of his tiny face, his dark hair, his closed eyes, his perfect fingers curled into fists. I love you, she whispered. I am so sorry. I love you so much. Then the nurses took him away to the NICU, and a security guard entered the room. Mrs. Whitmore, I am very sorry, Bill, but I have court orders. You are not permitted to visit the NICU without supervision. I will be posted outside your son's room. Grace tried to get out of bed, but her body was weak and exhausted. Please, she begged. Please let me see him. I cannot. Ma'am, court order. The guard left. The door closed. Grace was alone in the recovery room. No baby, no husband, nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat and the knowledge that she had lost. Grace was discharged from the hospital on December 28th. Her body ached. Her breasts were swollen with milk for a baby she was not allowed to feed. She moved through the hours like a ghost. Claire drove her back to the apartment. The empty nursery Grace had set up waited like a mockery. A crib assembled by Claire's husband. Tiny clothes washed and folded. Books stacked on a shelf. But no baby. Dylan was still in the NICU. Thriving, according to the nurses. But Grace was only allowed to visit for 1 hour each day, supervised by a court-appointed monitor. On her first visit, Grace arrived at the hospital to find Marcus already in Dylan's room. He stood beside the incubator, looking down at their son with an expression that might have been tenderness if Grace had not known better. You can have 30 minutes, Marcus said without looking at her. I am generously allowing you that much. Grace wanted to scream at him, wanted to claw his eyes out. Instead, she walked past him and stood beside her son's incubator. Dylan slept peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Tubes and wires connected him to machines. He looked so fragile. Grace reached through the incubator openings and touched his hand. His fingers wrapped around her pinky instinctively. She whispered, Mama is here. Mama loves you. I am going to fix this. Marcus laughed softly behind her. You should have just stayed quiet, Grace. Now you have lost it everything. She turned to face him. I still have the truth. Truth does not matter when I have the judge, the lawyers, and the money. You are going to spend the rest of your life watching me raise our son while you get supervised visits twice a week. That is your truth now. The monitor at the door cleared her throat. Mrs. Whitmore, you have 20 minutes remaining. Grace turned back to Dylan. She sang to him softly, an old lullaby her mother used to sing. She told him about the world waiting for him and she promised him that she would never stop fighting. When her time was up, She kissed her fingertips and pressed them gently against the incubator glass. "I will be back tomorrow," she whispered. Marcus waited until she left, then posted a photo on Instagram. Him holding Dylan. Caption reading, "Blessed to be a father. Family is everything." Grace saw the post when she got home. She threw her phone across the room and collapsed on the floor, sobbing until there was nothing left inside her. That night, Claire came over with news. "Grace, Richard Sullivan wants to meet with you." The prosecutor. "He says they have enough evidence to file criminal charges against Marcus." Grace looked up from the couch where she had been staring at the wall for hours. Criminal charges. Embezzlement, fraud, tax evasion. If he is convicted, he loses custody automatically. We can get Dylan back. For the first time in days, Grace felt hope. When? Tomorrow. But Grace, there is a complication. Marcus's lawyers filed a motion claiming you are an unreliable witness due to postpartum psychosis. They are trying to discredit you before the criminal case even starts. I do not have postpartum psychosis. I know that, but they are going to use your grief against you. The crying, the emotional distress, they will make it look like mental illness instead of normal maternal separation anxiety. Grace stood slowly. Then we need to be smarter, faster. We need to hit him before he can destroy my credibility. Claire nodded. That is exactly what I was thinking. They met with Richard Sullivan the next morning. He was sympathetic but direct. "Mrs. Whitmore, I believe you. I believe Marcus Whitmore is a criminal who has been stealing from his company and his employees. But I need your testimony to be rock solid. If his lawyers can paint you as emotionally unstable, it undermines everything. And what do you need from me? I need you to face the psychiatric evaluation. Get a clean bill of health. Then I need you to testify before a grand jury. Can you do that?" Grace thought about Dylan in the NICU, about Marcus smirking at her, about Bianca Rhodes wearing her husband's ring and living her life. "Yes," Grace said, "I can do that." The psychiatric evaluation was scheduled for the following afternoon. Grace arrived at the office of Dr. William Hayes, a stern man in his 60s who had been appointed by the court. He asked her questions designed to trap her, questions about her mental state, her emotional stability, her fitness as a mother. "Do you have thoughts of harming yourself?" he asked. "No." "Have you experienced irrational anger or violent impulses?" "Anger, yes, but not irrational. My husband cheated on me, stole from me, and is trying to take my child. I think anger is the only rational response." Dr. Hayes made notes. "Do you hear voices?" "No." "Have you experienced hallucinations or delusions?" "No." "Mrs. Whitmore, your husband's legal team has provided recordings of you crying alone in your apartment, talking to yourself, showing signs of extreme distress." Grace's blood went cold. "He bugged my apartment. I cannot speak to how the recordings were obtained, but they do show concerning behavior." Grace realized the trap. Marcus had been listening the whole time. Every moment of grief, every whispered prayer. He had used her pain against her. "Dr. Hayes," Grace said carefully, "I am a woman who just gave birth prematurely to a child I am not allowed to care for. My husband abandoned me while I was pregnant. He is trying to steal everything I have. If I were not crying, that would be concerning. Grief is not mental illness. It is being human." The doctor studied her for a long moment. Then he closed his notebook. "I agree with you, Mrs. Whitmore. You are experiencing normal emotional responses to extraordinary circumstances. I will submit my report to the court. You are mentally fit to care for your child." Grace almost collapsed with relief, but the relief was short-lived. That evening, Marcus made his next move, a knock on Grace's door. She opened it to find Victoria Whitmore, Marcus's mother, standing in the hallway. Victoria was 70 years old with perfectly styled silver hair and cold blue eyes. "May I come in?" she asked. Grace stepped aside. Victoria walked into the apartment, looked around with thinly veiled disdain, and sat on the couch without being invited. "Grace, I am going to be direct. Marcus is my son. I have watched you try to destroy him. I cannot allow that. He destroyed himself. Perhaps, but Dylan is my grandson. I have filed for grandparents' rights. Between Marcus's custody and my petition, you will never see Dylan unsupervised again. That is a promise." Grace felt the room tilt. You watched him abuse me for years, she whispered. I watched you try to destroy my family. There is a difference. Victoria stood. Think very carefully about your next moves. Grace, you are outmatched. She left. Grace stood alone in her apartment, feeling the last shreds of hope crumble. She had lost her husband, her home, her child, her freedom. Marcus was winning, and there was nothing she could do about it. Grace spent 3 days in a fog of despair. She went to her supervised visits with Dylan. She met with Claire and Richard Sullivan. She went through the motions of living while feeling completely dead inside. On the third night at midnight, her doorbell rang. Grace opened the door to find a man in his late 20s standing in the hallway. He had Marcus's dark hair but softer features. His eyes were nervous. I am sorry to come so late, he said. I am Ethan, Marcus's brother. Can we talk? Grace stared at him. She had met Ethan exactly twice. Once at her wedding, once at a family Christmas 3 years ago. Marcus rarely spoke about his younger brother. Did Marcus send you? She asked. Marcus does not know I am here. If he finds out, he will destroy me too. But I need to talk to you. Grace should have closed the door, should have called Claire, should have protected herself. Instead, she stepped aside and let him in. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped between his knees. I do not know how to say this, so I am just going to say it. Marcus has been embezzling from the company for 3 years. I have proof. Grace sat down slowly. Why are you telling me this? Because I helped him. I did not know what I was doing at first. He told me the transactions were legitimate, but about 6 months ago, I started asking questions. That is when he threatened me. Threatened you how? He said if I told anyone, he would frame me for everything, make it look like I was the one stealing. He has emails with my signature, documents I signed without reading carefully. If this goes to trial, he will blame me and walk away clean. So why are you here? Ethan looked at her with genuine pain in his eyes. Because I have a daughter. She is 4 years old. And I saw what Marcus did to you, how he used you and discarded you. I cannot let him win. Not if it means teaching my daughter that men like Marcus get away with destroying women. He pulled a flash drive from his pocket. This has everything. Unaltered financial records. Emails between Marcus and Bianca discussing how to hide assets. Proof of every fraudulent transaction. It is enough to send him to prison for 20 years. Grace took the flash drive with shaking hands. Why not give this to the prosecutor yourself? Because Marcus will destroy me in court. I need immunity, and I need someone he cannot intimidate. Someone brave enough to stand up to him. He looked at her. That someone is you. Grace thought about everything Marcus had taken from her. Then she thought about Dylan in the NICU, about the supervised visits, about the way Marcus smirked every time she walked into the room. What do you need me to do? She asked. Give the drive to your prosecutor. Tell him I will testify in exchange for immunity, and help me make sure Marcus pays for what he has done. Grace called Claire immediately. They called Richard Sullivan. By 3 a.m, they were all gathered in Grace's apartment, reviewing the contents of the flash drive. Richard Sullivan's eyes grew wider with each file. This is incredible, he whispered. Bank records showing $40 million moved through shell companies. Emails discussing tax evasion strategies. Proof that Marcus used company funds to buy Bianca's apartment, her car, her jewelry. This is a federal case. He looked at Ethan. You are willing to testify? Yes, but I need immunity from prosecution. I can arrange that. But you need to understand, your brother will try to destroy you on the stand. Let him try, Ethan said quietly. Richard Sullivan stood. I need to move fast. If Marcus gets wind that we have this evidence, he will flee the country. I am calling the FBI tonight. We are going to set up a sting operation. Grace felt her heart pounding. A sting operation. We need Marcus to confess on tape. Audio evidence to support the documents. Are you willing to wear a wire? Grace thought about Dylan, about justice, about making sure Marcus could never hurt anyone again. Yes, she said. I will do it. The plan was simple but dangerous. Grace would call Marcus and agree to meet him privately to negotiate custody. She would wear a wire. Marcus, arrogant and confident, would likely incriminate himself. The FBI would be listening. The moment Marcus confessed, They would move in for the arrest. They set the meeting for the following evening at Marcus's penthouse office. Grace spent the day preparing. Claire coached her on what to say. Richard Sullivan briefed her on what they needed for a conviction. FBI agents fitted her with a tiny microphone hidden in a necklace. At 7 that evening, Grace walked into the building where Marcus's company occupied the top 3 floors. The security guard recognized her. "Mrs. Whitmore, he is expecting you. 30th floor." The elevator ride felt like descending into hell. Grace's hands trembled. The wire against her skin felt like it was burning. The elevator doors opened. Marcus stood in the lobby of his office suite, wearing a tailored suit and his characteristic smug smile. "Grace," he said, "you look tired." "I am tired, Marcus, tired of fighting. I came to negotiate." He gestured toward his office. "Let us talk like adults." They walked into his corner office. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. A bottle of expensive scotch sat on his desk. Marcus poured himself a drink. "Want one?" "No." He sat behind his desk like a king on a throne. "So, you want to negotiate? What are you offering?" Grace sat down carefully. "I will sign over my parental rights, give you full custody, drop all the lawsuits. In exchange, I want enough money to start over, somewhere far from here." Marcus laughed. "You think I am going to pay you to disappear? I think we both know this war is destroying us. You have Dylan. You won. Let me leave with some dignity." He studied her for a long moment. "You are finally being reasonable. That is progress. So we have a deal." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Here is the thing, Grace. I do not need to make a deal with you. I already won. You have no leverage, no money, no credibility. The only reason I agreed to this meeting was to watch you beg." Grace forced tears into her eyes. "Please, Marcus, I just want to see my son. Please." "Oh, you can see him. Twice a week. Supervised. For the rest of his childhood. That is what happens when you try to destroy me." "I never tried to destroy you. I just wanted the truth." "The truth?" Marcus laughed again. "The truth is that I built an empire while you sat at home playing architect. The truth is that you were useful for a while and then you became a burden. The truth is that Bianca is everything you are not. Young, beautiful, ambitious. She understands what it takes to win. Did she understand that you were stealing millions from your company to pay for her lifestyle?" Marcus's smile faltered slightly. "I did not steal anything. I am the CEO. That money is mine. $40 million through shell companies. That is theft. Marcus, who told you about 40 million? His voice had turned cold. Grace pushed harder. "I know everything. The offshore accounts, the fake vendors, the way you skimmed payroll to fund your affair. You think you are clever, but you are just a thief in an expensive suit." Marcus stood abruptly. "You are recording this, are you not? You are wearing a wire." Grace's heart stopped. "No, I—" Marcus moved around the desk fast. He grabbed her necklace and ripped it off. The microphone clattered to the floor. "Did you really think I am that stupid?" he hissed. The door burst open. FBI agents flooded the room, weapons drawn, FBI hands where we can see them. Marcus froze. His face went from rage to shock to fear in seconds. The lead agent, a tall man in his 40s, stepped forward. "Marcus Whitmore, you are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent." Marcus looked at Grace with pure hatred. "You did this. You destroyed me." Grace stood, her legs shaking. "No, Marcus, you destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone knew." They cuffed him, led him past his employees who had gathered in the hallway to watch. Led him into the elevator while cameras flashed. Grace stood in the office, breathing hard, surrounded by FBI agents. Richard Sullivan appeared beside her. "You did it. We have enough to convict him 10 times over." Grace felt no joy, no satisfaction. She just felt tired. "Can I see my son now?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Richard Sullivan said. "I will file an emergency motion tonight. By morning, you will have full custody." Grace nodded. Then she walked out of Marcus's empire and did not look back. The emergency custody hearing was held at 8 the following morning. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, her expression stern as she reviewed the FBI's arrest report. Marcus appeared via video from county jail, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his tailored suits. His lawyer, Victoria Cross, looked significantly less polished than usual. Your Honor, Victoria Cross began, these are preliminary charges. My client has not been convicted of anything. Revoking custody based on allegations seems premature. Judge Morrison cut her off. Counselor, your client was arrested by federal agents after confessing to $40 million in fraud while attempting to intimidate a witness. He is currently being held without bail as a flight risk. This court's primary concern is the welfare of the child. She turned to Grace. Mrs. Whitmore, I have reviewed Dr. Hayes' psychiatric evaluation. You are deemed mentally fit to care for your son. I have also reviewed the evidence of Mr. Whitmore's criminal activity and his extended absence during your pregnancy. The emergency custody order is hereby reversed. Full custody is granted to Grace Whitmore, effective immediately. Grace felt her knees weaken with relief. Marcus's face on the screen turned red. This is ridiculous. She is manipulating everyone, Your Honor. I have rights. Mr. Whitmore, Judge Morrison said coldly, you forfeited your rights when you chose to commit federal crimes while abandoning your pregnant wife. You will have supervised visitation from prison, if and when you are granted such privileges. This hearing is adjourned. The screen went dark on Marcus's furious face. Grace stood, legs shaking. Claire hugged her tightly. You did it. Dylan is yours. An hour later, Grace walked into the NICU without a security guard blocking her path. The nurses smiled at her as she approached Dylan's incubator. Mrs. Whitmore, one nurse said gently, he has been waiting for you. Grace reached into the incubator and picked up her son for the first time without supervision. Dylan was still tiny, still connected to monitors, but he had gained weight. His eyes opened and seemed to focus on her face. Hi, baby, Grace whispered. Mama is here, and I am never leaving again. She held him for 2 hours, singing softly, telling him stories, memorizing every detail of his face. When the doctors finally said Dylan was stable enough to go home in another week, Grace cried tears of pure relief. Outside the hospital, reporters waited. News of Marcus's arrest had exploded across social media. Tech CEO arrested for fraud. Pregnant wife exposes husband's crimes. Grace made a brief statement. I am grateful for the legal system that protected my son. I am grateful for the prosecutor and the FBI who took this seriously. And I am grateful to every woman who has ever had to fight for her children. We are stronger than anyone knows. The cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. Grace ignored them all and went home. Over the next 6 months, Marcus's case moved through the federal court system. Ethan testified with immunity, providing detailed accounts of Marcus's fraud schemes. 40 employees testified about wage theft. The prosecutor built an airtight case. In July, Marcus Whitmore was convicted on 19 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. The sentencing hearing took place on a sweltering summer day. Grace sat in the courtroom gallery, Dylan, now 6 months old and healthy, sitting on her lap. Judge Patricia Morrison read the sentence with no emotion. Mr. Whitmore, you have been convicted of systematically stealing from your employees, your investors, and your wife. You showed no remorse and attempted to intimidate witnesses. The sentence of this court is 15 years in federal prison with restitution of $40 million to be paid to the victims. Marcus's face was blank. He looked older, thinner, broken. As the guards led him away, he glanced at Grace one last time. She held Dylan tighter and looked away. He was already a memory. That evening, Claire came over to celebrate. They sat on Grace's small balcony, watching the sunset, while Dylan slept peacefully in his crib. What are you going to do now? Claire asked. Grace thought about the question. She had spent 6 months rebuilding her life, taking care of Dylan, attending every court hearing, watching Marcus's empire crumble. But she had not thought about what came next. I want to build something, Grace said slowly. Something that matters. Something that helps other women who are going through what I went through. Claire smiled. Like what? Like a housing project. Affordable homes for single mothers escaping abuse or financial devastation. Places where women can rebuild their lives safely. That is ambitious. I have $4.8 million from the house sale. Marcus will never see a penny of it. I want to use it to do something good. Claire raised her glass. To new beginnings. Grace clinked her glass against Claire's. To hope. The sun set over the city, painting the sky orange and gold. For the first time in a year, Grace felt like she could breathe. Grace spent the next year designing her vision. She called it the Dillon Foundation, named after her son, a symbol of survival and rebirth. The project was simple but powerful small, affordable homes for single mothers and their children, not shelters or temporary housing, real homes with real leases and real dignity. Grace designed each unit herself. 2 bedrooms, open kitchens, large windows for natural light, shared community spaces where families could build support networks. She partnered with Robert Hayes, who helped find land outside the city. She hired Claire's firm to handle the legal paperwork. She convinced a dozen local businesses to donate materials and labor. The first phase of construction began in the spring. 6 houses, built side by side on a quiet street lined with trees. Grace visited the site every day, Dillon on her hip, watching the structures rise from bare foundations into homes. Workers waved at her. Neighbors stopped with questions and offers of help. Local news covered the project with headlines like, "From Heartbreak to Hope, Architect Builds Community for Struggling Mothers." By December, 1 year after the worst Christmas of her life, the first families moved in. Grace stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, holding Dillon, who was now walking and babbling constantly. Claire stood beside her. Robert Hayes smiled from the crowd. Even Ethan was there with his daughter. The mayor gave a speech about community and resilience. Grace took the microphone last. "A year ago," she said, her voice steady, "I thought my life was over. I was alone, pregnant, and fighting a man who had more power and money than I could imagine. But I learned something important. When everything is taken from you, you discover what you are really made of." She looked at the families gathering on the porches of their new homes. Children playing in the yard, women smiling, some crying, all hopeful. "These homes are not charity," Grace continued. "They are investments in the future. Every woman here is strong, capable, and deserving of a fresh start. The Dillon Foundation exists to remind everyone that survival is not weakness. It is the beginning of something greater." The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. Grace cut the ribbon with Dillon's tiny hand on top of hers. Later that evening, after the ceremony ended and the guests left, Grace walked through the empty community center. The walls were painted soft yellow. Children's drawings were already hung on a bulletin board. She stood in the middle of the room and closed her eyes, remembering Christmas Eve 2 years ago. The loneliness, the fear, the moment she decided to fight. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. She opened it hesitantly. It was from Marcus. "I saw the news about your project. I am glad you found purpose. I am sorry for what I did. I hope someday you can forgive me." Grace stared at the message for a long time. Then she deleted it without responding. Forgiveness was not something she owed him, and his apology meant nothing. He was serving year 2 of 15. Bianca Rhodes had been indicted as an accessory and was awaiting trial. His mother, Victoria, had stopped calling after the conviction. Marcus's world had collapsed completely. In Grace, she had built something new. She walked outside where Claire was waiting by the car, holding Dillon. "Ready to go home?" Claire asked. Grace looked back at the row of houses, lights glowing in the windows, families settling in for their first night. "Yes," she said. "I am ready." They drove back to Grace's apartment. It was still small and modest, but it was hers, paid for with money she had earned, filled with furniture she had chosen. A safe place where she and Dillon could grow. That night, after Dillon was asleep, Grace sat by the window and looked out at the city lights. She thought about the woman she used to be, the woman who believed love meant sacrifice and trust meant blindness. That woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who knew her worth, someone who could build empires from ashes. Grace whispered to the night, "Thank you, Marcus, for showing me exactly who I could become when I stopped trying to be what you wanted." Then she turned off the lights and went to bed. Tomorrow, she had plans to draw, more houses to design, more women to help. The war was over, and Grace had won. Snow fell softly on Christmas Eve, 2 years after the night that changed everything. Grace stood in the kitchen of her new home, a modest but beautiful house she had designed herself. It was not as large as the mansion she had once lived in with Marcus, but every inch of it was hers. Dylan, now 2.5 years old, played with wooden blocks on the living room floor. His dark hair fell into his eyes. His laugh filled the house with warmth. The doorbell rang. Grace opened it to find Claire and her husband, Robert Hayes and his wife, and Ethan with his daughter Emma. "Merry Christmas," Claire said, holding a bottle of wine and a wrapped present. They gathered around the dining table Grace had built from reclaimed wood. The meal was simple but perfect. Roasted chicken, vegetables from the community garden at the Dillon Foundation, fresh bread from the local bakery that had donated ovens to the project. As they ate, they talked about the foundation's success. 47 families now lived in Dillon Foundation homes. Plans were underway for a second location. Grace's architecture firm had reopened with the new focus affordable housing and community design. She had hired 3 employees, all women rebuilding their lives after hardship. "You have done something incredible," Robert Hayes said, raising his glass. "Your father would be so proud." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I hope so." After dinner, after the guests left, after Dylan was tucked into bed, Grace sat by the window with a cup of tea. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Marcus. Over the past 2 years, he had written to her occasionally, apologizing, explaining, begging for forgiveness, or at least acknowledgement. She had never responded. This message read, "Merry Christmas. Grace, I think about you and Dylan every day. I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I hope someday you will let me meet our son." Grace set the phone down. She thought about the question carefully, not with anger anymore, just with clarity. Marcus was Dylan's biological father. Someday, Dylan might want to know him, but that was Dylan's choice to make when he was older, not hers to force or deny. For now, Marcus was a stranger serving time for his crimes, and Grace had no obligation to make peace with him. She picked up the phone and typed a single sentence. "Dylan will decide if he wants to know you when he is old enough to understand who you are and what you did. Until then, leave us alone." She hit send. Then she blocked his number. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the streets in white. The house was warm. Dylan was safe. Grace was free. She looked at the framed photo on the mantel. Her and Dylan at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Dillon Foundation. Both of them smiling, both of them whole. Grace whispered to herself, "We made it, baby. We really made it." The next morning, Christmas Day, Grace woke to Dylan jumping on her bed, squealing with excitement about presents under the tree. They opened gifts slowly. Toys for Dylan, books for Grace, a sweater Claire had knitted. Afterward, they drove to the Dillon Foundation. Grace had promised the families there a Christmas celebration. The community center was decorated with lights and paper snowflakes made by the children. Tables were loaded with food brought by volunteers. Music played softly. Grace walked through the crowd, holding Dylan's hand, greeting each family by name. A young woman named Sarah approached her, holding a toddler. "Mrs. Whitmore, I wanted to thank you. 6 months ago, I was living in my car with my daughter. Now we have a home, a real home. You gave us hope." Grace hugged her. "You gave yourself hope. You just needed someone to believe in you." As the party continued, Grace stepped outside for air. The sun was bright against the snow. Children played in the yard. Families laughed inside. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. The betrayal, the pain, the fight, the victory. She had lost so much, her marriage, her innocence, her belief that love was enough to protect her. But she had gained something more valuable. Her strength, her purpose, her peace. Grace looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you for breaking me so I could become this." Pushing inside, Dylan called for her. "Mama, come play." She smiled and went back inside to her son, her community, her new life. The war was not just over. Grace had transcended it. 3 years after Marcus's arrest, Grace received an official request. Marcus wanted to see her. One final meeting. He claimed he had something important to say. Grace's first instinct was to refuse. She had built a life without him. Dylan was thriving. The Dillon Foundation had expanded to 3 locations across the state. housing 112 families. But Claire convinced her to go. "You need closure," Claire said. "Not for him, for you." So on a cold February morning, Grace drove to the federal prison 2 hours outside the city. The visiting room was stark and gray, metal tables bolted to the floor, guards stationed at every corner, the smell of industrial cleaner and despair. Marcus was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit. He had aged dramatically. His hair was streaked with gray. His face was thinner. The arrogant confidence that once defined him was gone. He sat down across from her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Marcus said, "Thank you for coming. I almost did not. I know, I do not deserve your time. I do not deserve anything from you." Grace studied his face. "What did you want to say?" Marcus took a breath. "I wanted to tell you that you were right about everything. I was a liar, a thief, a terrible husband. I destroyed the best thing I ever had because I was too arrogant to see what mattered." "Is this your apology?" Grace asked quietly. "No, I know you do not want my apology. I wanted to tell you something else. Bianca visited me once after I was arrested. She told me she never loved me. She said I was useful until I was not. Then she left and I never saw her again." Grace felt nothing at the revelation. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I finally understood what I did to you. I used you the same way she used me. I took everything you gave and threw it away like it meant nothing. And now I am sitting here with nothing while you are out there building something incredible. I saw the news about the Dylan Foundation. I am not asking for forgiveness, Grace. I am asking you to keep doing what you are doing. Be the person I should have been." Grace looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Marcus, I did not come here for closure. I came here to remind myself why I left. And you just gave me exactly what I needed." She stood. Marcus looked up at her. "Will you ever let Dylan know me? That is Dylan's choice to make when he is old enough. But I will tell him the truth. That his father was brilliant and charismatic and broken. That he hurt people because he could not see past his own ego. And that I loved him once. But I love our son more." Marcus nodded slowly. "That is fair." Grace walked toward the door. Then she stopped and turned back. "Marcus, you asked me once what I would do without you. You said I was nothing without your empire. Do you remember?" He nodded. "I built my own empire. One that actually helps people. One that is not built on lies and theft. And I did it without you. So thank you for leaving me alone that Christmas. It forced me to become someone I never knew I could be." She walked out without looking back. The drive home was long and quiet. Grace thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago, pregnant and alone and terrified. That woman had survived. And in surviving, she had become something more. When Grace arrived home, Dylan ran to greet her. "Mama, where did you go?" "I had to say goodbye to someone." "Who?" "Someone who used to be important, but is not anymore." Dylan did not understand, but he hugged her legs and laughed. "Can we make cookies?" "Yes, baby, we can make cookies." That night, after Dylan was asleep, Grace sat at her desk and sketched. New housing designs, a fourth location for the Dylan Foundation, plans for a national expansion. Her phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "How did it go?" Grace smiled and typed back, "It went perfectly. I am finally free." She looked around her small home office. Framed photos of Dylan covered the walls. Architecture awards from the State Housing Commission. Letters from families whose lives had been changed by her foundation. Grace thought about revenge, how she had never wanted it. She had only wanted justice and peace, and she had found both. Not by destroying Marcus, though he had destroyed himself, but by building something that mattered more than any grudge or anger or pain. Grace whispered to the quiet room, 2 years ago, he left me in the dark. Today, I am the light for hundreds of women finding their way home. She closed her sketchbook and turned off the lamp. Tomorrow, she had a meeting with city planners about the fourth Dylan Foundation location. She had designs to finalize and families to interview. The past was behind her. The future was hers to build. And Grace Whitmore, survivor and architect of hope, was just getting started.